Great. Well, thanks for joining us, first of all.
Great pleasure.
And you're giving a talk at this conference called To Cluster or Stand Apart, about how cities, and you picked the examples of London, Paris, and Frankfurt, have made decisions to cluster their tall buildings in discrete areas away from other uses or historic downtowns. Tell us about that topic, why that interests you.
Well, essentially because I'm interested in urban matters, and particularly the European city. And therefore, one starts to think back from where we are now to where the genesis of development has taken place, or why. And it seemed to me that actually there's something about these examples that have commonalities. I mean, they're all on rivers. They all share a sense of history. But the histories are very different. So I wanted just to track back and see where an instinct, for instance, about landscape begins to affect the decisions now and for the future. And that's certainly a very defining feature of all three, is very different.
And so what did you find in each three cities as you were looking back and doing research? London, Paris, Frankfurt. How did they each approach this, and which works the best? I'm
sure this is obvious to anyone who has studied history in urban history in a lot of depth, but you know, there's a sense, for instance, in Paris about axiality, about horizon, which is very different.
Because everything emanates out from the Arc de Triomphe, is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, from the Louvre, you know, moving through the Tuileries up to, you know, the l'Arc de Triomphe, and then onto the Grande Arche of La Défense. And,
which that's the new district with all the new modern tall buildings.
La Défense. So the decision is one of a number of, you know, very brave, rather monumental decisions that are taken, starting with, of course, Louis XIV and the establishment of Versailles, and the consideration of landscape there, which was to create a false horizon that worked to infinity. And so it's a very interesting instinct, and the one around which La Défense is based. So, yeah.
Does that work on the ground? I mean, that makes sense from a almost artistic perspective, right, and conceptually.
Well, I think that inevitably when one takes a kind of radical line of that kind, and obviously La Défense, where, and this I shall be talking about, but the next decision, like the artificial level that was created at Versailles, you know, the same thing happens at La Défense. So the platform is created. And that creates a kind of a common ground, so that developers start from the platform and not from what's below, because that's a common territory. It's a very interesting whole set of effects that come from that.
And how about London and Frankfurt?
Well, yeah, turning to Frankfurt, you know, Frankfurt is a resultant of that very typical Middle European phenomena. Without borders, each of the cities had to create their own defensive conditions. So you tend to get early moats, and then that developing into to defensive sections that are responding to artillery and ballistics. And so you get the star-shaped bastions that were typical. So obviously in Vienna, you know, we know all about what happened to the ring there. It's the kind of moment when Vienna starts to redefine itself, getting rid of the shackles of the ring. And the same is very much true of many of the German cities. Not least because of the kind of extraordinary history of war and defense that was part of everyday life in the 16th century, before it and after it. So what then happens to that defensive ring is that it becomes a kind of communicative space for the city. And the decision is to build within or without. And that's a very different proposition to the French, rather confident, kind of consideration of landscape and horizon, and indeed London, which is bound not so much by defence as political difference, because the City of London is one of several cities in London, and it is different because of its structure at a local level and its ownership patterns and so on. So not ghettoizing, as it were, the business district, because it was always the business district, to a new centre, as with La Défense, or indeed some of the conditions without the wall at Frankfurt, where you get the allée of tall buildings. In London, there's then the consideration of St Paul's Heights, and how the views of St Paul's is something that was established in the 20th century, in the 30s, as the city began to rise at that early stage. How and where, between the UNESCO kind of World Heritage Site of the Tower of London, St Paul's Cathedral, and other aspects of viewing corridors, how do you create taller buildings? And they end up being within very limited territories that are not going to cause offence, or contradict those visual kind of corridors that have been established. And so you get a very close clustering of buildings. And it's a very different attitude to the urban landscape that has generated that. So the three, for me, all rising out of historic fabric and layers, are a fascinating trilogy to look at.
So just so I understand what happened in Frankfurt, they ended up building all around? Tall buildings were clustered all around the outside, or what was the decision?
No, there were a series of areas that were without the historic core, but within the defensive bastions. And then there was a decision to build a series of tall buildings that, as I say, form a line with rather well-behaved distance between them, moving beyond the ex-defensive territory, now public gardens, towards the railway station and the Messe, the fair. So very, very interesting. And also there have been some outriggers, some outsiders, like the tower for the European Bank, for instance, headquarters, that have appeared in another territory, leaving, like London, the relationship between the cathedral and other historic buildings intact, and a kind of clustering from certain angles, which is a very different consideration to where buildings stand together or apart.
But can we say then which city's layout works the best? Paris, Frankfurt, and London? Can other cities take any lessons from the stories of these cities? I'm
absolutely convinced that other cities can take a lot of lessons from these cities. They're extraordinarily rich, for good and bad. So it's, but I wouldn't say there's a better or worse. They are different, and they're different for cultural and historical reasons, which is what really interests me.
So other cities that are dealing with where to put new clusters of tall buildings, we're here in Sydney, certainly something under consideration in Australia as they're rapidly growing, Melbourne and Sydney. Cities around the world are dealing with this on a daily basis almost these days as the cities continue to grow. So how should we take the lessons of Paris, Frankfurt, and London to inform that process?
I think that each is particular. Each must be based around the politics of place and the makers of place. So, but what I would say is that the skyline is an incredibly important part of the kind of psychological makeup of a city. And whilst it's possible to avoid a lower building if you don't like it by turning a corner, it's impossible to do the same for bad tall buildings. So, and it is also true that tall buildings tend to last because they're very expensive to pull down. So, it's a warning that the quality of the process of getting to and procuring a building and what it looks like and its effect is incredibly important. I mean, city planners obviously understand this, but it's a question of how decisions are made, and they'll be rude if they're bad ones.
Sydney is an interesting example of something that the conference this year is focusing on, of these polycentric cities, where we've got multiple downtown areas and nodes of dense development, and not just one downtown. It makes sense in Sydney because there's all these different peninsulas that jut out into the harbor, so just geographically, it sort of naturally could happen that way. But that's more and more what's happening in a lot of cities as they grow. They have more than just one downtown.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you think that this whole notion of how the skyline really defines the city, if that changes at all when you have multiple downtowns, is there a risk that you kind of just lost without an orienting downtown, or can a city have multiple skylines?
Well, of course it can. The question is how it is differentiated and how it's seen from different critical positions. I mean, I suppose the act of, the threshold of entering a city is still an incredibly exciting and interesting one. And it is true that in the case of London, there are a huge number of tall buildings that are emerging. At a certain point, it does become a kind of a cacophony if you're not careful. So, but naturally, I think the other aspect that's been touched on already at this conference is the one of infrastructure. And where infrastructure happens, there will be change, and that change needs to be thought about. So that's perfectly true of most cities where new infrastructure routes are placed, and at these crossings, infrastructural crossings, become new nodes. And why not? I think it indeed is important that cities have a kind of gradation and moments of intensity and moments of much more relaxed sense of their kind of dialogue with the topography that's more natural and historical.